Wine sat in a corner of the competition hall, quietly collecting her belongings. Her heart was heavy and her trembling hands struggled to gather the tools she had worked so hard with. Tears streamed down her cheeks and she whispered to herself. Her voice broken. I worked so hard, but maybe this just isn't for me. Dragging her bag behind her, she headed outside in search of Jungkook. Her feet faltered as she spotted him in the hallway, but before she could approach, her steps froze. Unintentionally, she overheard a heated conversation between Jungkook and Mrs. Jones. Mom, this is unfair. Why did you do this to my wife? He emphasized the word with anger, his voice low yet seething. Mrs. Jones crossed her arms, her expression, I see. I didn't do anything on purpose. She didn't even meet the guidelines. But before he could continue, a female contestant approached them timidly, her hands shaking as she bowed respectfully before Mrs. Jones. Ma'am, I want to tell you something. Mrs. Jones looked at her with an impatient glare, her voice laced with annoyance. What is it? Hurry up, I don't have all day. Chloe swallowed nervously and spoke, her voice trembling. Ma'am, it's unfair to whine. Yesterday, I saw Clara with another woman in the studio. They were doing something at Wine's makeup table, and today her straightener's cord was broken. Jungkook's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward Chloe. Do you have any proof of what you are saying? Chloe hesitated but quickly nodded, fumbling with her phone as she unlocked it. Yes, I recorded it. Here, see for yourself. She handed her phone to Jungkook, who grabbed it with urgency. His brows furrowed as he watched the video intently. Mrs. Jones' composed demeanor faltered for a moment, a bead of sweat forming on her forehead. Jungkook, don't trust her. She's just trying to stir trouble. But Jungkook ignored her protests, his focus glued to the screen. The video showed Clara alongside another woman with a covered face, tampering with Wine's makeup station. The footage zoomed in on Clara's smirk as she sabotaged Wine's straightener. Jungkook's jaw tightened as he noticed a subtle yet familiar detail. He paused the video and zoomed in on the wrist of the covered woman, spotting a tattoo, a unique symbol he recognized immediately. His gaze snapped to Mrs. Jones, his voice cold and cutting. That's you, Mom. Mrs. Jones' eyes widened, but she quickly masked her shock with indignation. Don't be ridiculous. You are accusing me based on a blurry video. Jungkook held the phone up, his glare unwavering. That tattoo doesn't lie. You were there helping Clara. You're really going to believe some random contestant over your own mother? She snapped, her voice trembling with anger and desperation. Jungkook's jaw clenched, his voice sharp and unyielding. I'm believing the proof, Mom, not excuses. Ignoring her protests, he turned his gaze toward the hallway where Wine stood. Her face pale and tears streaked. He stepped toward her, his expression softening slightly, but his grip firm as he took her hand. Come with me. Wine blinked, startled by the sudden gesture, but followed him silently. Jungkook strode back into the studio, his commanding voice booming across the space. Everyone gather here immediately. All contestants and judges 10 minutes. The weight of his voice left no room for questions. And so the studio was filled with murmuring contestants and confused judges. Mr. Park, one of the senior judges, stepped forward with a frown. Jungkook, what is the meaning of this? Why have you called us here? Standing tall at the front of the room, Jungkook held up a phone, his expression unreadable. I will explain, but first watch this. He connected close phone to the projector, and the room dimmed as the video began to play on the large screen. The footage was shaky but clear enough to reveal Clara and another figure with a cold face tampering with Wine's makeup station. The contestants and judges leaned forward, their eyes glued to the screen as Clara smirked and fiddled with the straightener's scotch. The video paused momentarily as Jungkook zoomed in on the tattoo on the accomplice's wrist, a distinctive mark that left no doubt about its owner. A collective gasp spread through the room. Clara Joan, he began coldly, turning to face her. You sabotaged another contestant. For this, you are disqualified and suspended from participating in any competition for the next 6 years. These events are held every 3 years, so you have effectively ruined your chances for two full cycles. Clara's face changed of color as she stammered. That's not fair. I didn't. Enough. His voice silenced her protests. The proof is undeniable. He then turned his attention to Mrs. John, whose face had turned visibly pale. Beads of sweat glistened on her forehead as the room fell silent, all eyes on her. And as for you, his voice grew colder, sharper. You used your authority as a judge to manipulate the results of this competition. From this moment forward, you are suspended from your position indefinitely. Jungkook, you are going to side with these people over your mother? Her voice wavered, panic creeping into her tone. I'm siding with Justice, Mom. His gaze was piercing, and you know what you did? The room remained in stunned silence as Wine stood at the back, her heart pounding, her vision blurred with tears as she watched everything unfold. After ensuring Clara and Mrs. Jones were removed from their positions, Jungkook finally turned to Wine. This competition isn't about favoritism or sabotage. It's about talent, and the winner by her creativity and perseverance is wine. Gasps filled the room as he made the announcement. Wine's hand flew to her mouth, her tears flowing freely as she processed his words. Without saying a word, he took her hand again, leading her out of the studio. The ride home was quiet, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. When they reached the house, Jungkook finally spoke, his tone softer than usual. You deserved to win, Wine. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Wine looked at him, her eyes shimmering with emotion. For the first time, she felt that beneath his colder exterior, there was someone who cared. As they entered the house, Wine let out a long breath, the weight of the day finally catching up to her. She walked to the living room and slumped onto the couch, her hands fumbling with the zipper of her jacket. Jungkook followed her in silence, his usual cold demeanor softened as he observed her exhausted frame. He sat down beside her, his arm brushing against hers as he leaned slightly closer. Congratulations, Wine. His voice was softer than usual, and for a moment it felt like he wasn't the intimidating Jungkook she knew. Wine looked at him, her lips curving into a small smile. Thank you for everything, for standing up for me today. I don't think I could have done it without you. She looked down, playing with the hem of her sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. I never expected you to. Before she could finish, Jungkook reached out, gently placing a hand under her chin and tilting her face toward him. His dark eyes bore into hers, filled with an intensity that made her heart race. I should have done it sooner. Wine blinked, her breath hitching as he leaned in closer. She could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. Lingering there for a moment, as if silently conveying everything he couldn't say out loud. Pulling back just enough to meet her gaze, he whispered, I'm sorry, Wine. I have been cold, distant. I never stood by your side the way I should have. But from now on, I promise I will protect you always. Wine's eyes widened, tears threatening to spill again as her lips quivered. She felt a warmth in his words she had longed for. Jungkook, unable to form the right words, she simply leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her close, as his fingers absent-mindedly traced soothing circles on her back. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was comforting. For the first time, Wine felt like she wasn't alone, and Jungkook seemed to realize how much she truly meant to him. After a while, Wine pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a shy smile. I will hold you to that promise. Jungkook smirked faintly, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. You should. I don't break promises. As Wine and Jungkook sat together, a rare moment of peace between them, the sound of the front door slamming open shattered the quiet. Wine flinched, instinctively gripping the edge of the couch as Mrs. June stormed in, her face twisted with anger. Jungkook, her sharp voice echoed in the room, making both of them turn. Jungkook sighed, his jaw tightening as he leaned back, his arm still protectively resting on the couch behind Wine. What now, Mom? What now? She scooped her hands on her hips as she glared at him. You will regret this, Jungkook. Mark my words. This poor girl, she spat the words as if they were venom. Pointing at Wine cannot give you the happiness you deserve. Look at her. She's nothing compared to Clara. Clara is from a respectable family, well educated, and enough. His voice boomed, cutting her off mid sentence. Wine flinched, and Mrs. Jones' eyes widened in disbelief. I don't want to hear another word about Clara. Mrs. Jones stepped back slightly but recovered quickly, her voice rising. You are blinded, Jungkook. Love, she scoffed. Love doesn't pay the bills or build connections. You are making a mistake with this girl. She will bring you nothing but shame. Jungkook stood towering over his mother as his expression darkened. He clenched his fists at his sides but keep his tone firm. Love doesn't see wealth or status, Mom, and for your information, I love her. He glanced at Vine, who was frozen in shock, her eyes wide. More than anything, and it's not that it matters, but she's my wife, the woman I chose. That alone is enough. Mrs. Joan looked stunned, her lips parting as if to argue, but Jungkook didn't stop. I have respected you all my life, Mom, but I won't tolerate you disrespecting Wine anymore. She is part of my family now, and I will protect her with everything I have. Mrs. Jones' face turned red with anger, but Jungkook continued. His voice colder now. You can't stay here anymore. What? She gasped, though disbelief evident in her tone. You have been staying here because of your position as a judge. But now that you have been suspended, there is no reason for you to stay. You can move back to Dad's house. I'm sure he will welcome you there. How dare you? It's not up for debate. His tone left no room for argument. I respect you, Mom, but I won't let you harm Wine. Not anymore. Mrs. Jones glared at Chip, her chest heaving with indignation. She turned to Wine, her eyes narrowing. You will regret this too, girl. Mark my words. Before Wine could respond, Jungkook stepped in front of her, shielding her from his mother's glare. That's enough. Pack your things, Mom. I will have someone drive you to Dad's place. Mrs. Jones stood there for a moment, her eyes filled with fury, but she finally stormed out of the living room, muttering under her breath. The sound of her footsteps faded as she went upstairs to pack. Jungkook turned to Wine, his shoulders relaxing as he saw the worry on her face. He sat back down beside her, taking her hand in his. You don't have to worry anymore. I will always protect you, no matter what. Wine blinked, tears welling up in her eyes as she nodded silently, overwhelmed by his sudden support and declaration. After Mrs. Jones stormed upstairs, Wine sat silently, still trying to process everything that had just happened. Jungkook noticed her quiet demeanor and gently squeezed her hand. Hey, his voice softened, his usual cold tone melting away. I meant what I said earlier. You don't have to face her alone anymore. Wine hesitated before nodding. Her lips trembled as she whispered, I never wanted to cause trouble between you and your mom. Jungkook sighed and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, his touch surprisingly tender. Trouble, she was wrong, Wine, and I'm not going to let anyone treat you unfairly, not even her. Before Wine could respond, the sound of Mrs. Jones' suitcase being dragged down the stairs filled the house. Both of them turned toward the noise. Mrs. Jones appeared in the doorway, her lips pressed into a thin line, her expression a mix of anger and hurt. I hope you realize what you are doing, Jungkook. You have chosen this girl over your own mother. Jungkook stood, his face unreadable. I have not chosen anyone over anyone else. Mom, but I won't stand by while you treat mine unfairly. It's not right, and you know it. Mrs. June opened her mouth to argue, but closed it again, clearly realizing she would not win. She gave Wine one last cold glare before turning to Jungkook. You will regret this. Jungkook didn't flinch. Instead, he called out to one of the house staff, take her bags and drive her to Dad's house. The staff member quickly grabbed Mrs. Jones' suitcase, and she followed him out without another word, slamming the front door behind her. The silence that followed was heavy, but Wine finally exhaled, her shoulders sagging in relief. Jungkook turned back to her, noticing the tears she was trying to hide. Hey, don't cry. Wine wiped her tears quickly, shaking her head. I'm sorry, I didn't want things to turn out like this. Jungkook crouched in front of her, his gaze intense as he rested his hands on her knees. Stop apologizing. None of this is your fault. If anything, I should have stood up for you sooner. Wine's lips quivered as she looked down at her hands. Jungkook gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. From now on, no one is going to make you feel like you don't belong. Not my mom, not anyone. Her eyes widened as his words sank in. He leaned closer, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, and whispered, I will protect you, Wine, always. Wine's tears fell lower again, but this time they were from relief. She managed a small smile, whispering back, Thank you, Jungkook, for everything. He smiled faintly before standing and pulling her to her feet. Come on, let's get you some rest. You have had a long day.